So welcome to your first social studies notes video. Hopefully we're going to be able to do a bunch of these this year, at least for as long as you guys are remote. We'll be able to do social studies notes this way. It does make it a little bit easier. You can kind of learn at your own pace, type your notes in at your own pace. It is really important though that you make sure you actually do your notes because this is kind of going to be the only lesson that you guys do on it. And you aren't going to do well on the test later on if you aren't taking the notes. So make sure you guys are actually taking the time, you're taking the notes, and you're getting them all in. That way when we have discussions later on, you'll know what you're doing. So your notes are going to look exactly like mine, with the exception of the fact that mine are going to have the answers pop in. And yours, here where it says hemisphere, yours will say type here. And so you'll just type in the answer. So let's talk about hemispheres. Hemispheres, latitude, and longitude are all things that you should kind of be familiar with already from past grades. So we're going to kind of briefly skim over these a little bit. That way we can move into some new content later on. But we're going to start with hemisphere. Okay, a hemisphere, if you break down the word hemisphere, you should know, if you break it right here between the I and the S, you should know what this word sphere means. You know what a sphere is. It's a ball, right? Like hemisphere, or a sphere is just a ball, which is what this is, right? It's a sphere. Hemi means half. So if you break down hemisphere, it literally means half a sphere. Now, when we talk about it in social studies, we're going to refer to it as being half of a globe. So what you should be doing now is in your notes section, you should be erasing where it says type here and putting in half of a globe. If you accidentally delete the type here, just click the undo button in the corner and it should bring it back. So a hemisphere is half a globe. Now, depending on how we cut the globe, depends on which hemispheres we're talking about. Okay, we can cut it here along this line, which is right there in the center, and cut it into a top and a bottom piece. Or, I gotta find it here on this little globe. It's right, it's this one. We can cut it kind of long ways like this. If we cut it that way, we can cut it into a left and a right part, which is what you see here. We have a northern, southern, western, and eastern hemisphere. So let's talk about those four hemispheres. Like I said, the map of the globe, or the map of the world, is divided into four hemispheres: the northern, southern, eastern, and western hemispheres. So let's start with the northern hemisphere. So if I were to cut the globe here along the center, I'm going to get a top and a bottom hemisphere. So if you think about like the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, that may have been backwards on your screen. But if we talk about the top hemisphere, it's the northern hemisphere. It's the one at the very tippy top. So countries that are in the northern, or not countries, continents that are in the northern hemisphere are North America. You are currently existing in the northern hemisphere. You are in North America, which is this continent here. Also, a very small part, little itty bitty part here of South America is in the northern hemisphere. It's kind of like the top of the head. Like if you were to cut your head off here, it's like the top part of South America. Also, Europe, so I'm going to spin my globe here. Spun the wrong direction. Europe, which is right here, that is where England, France, Germany, all those countries are in Europe. Most of Africa, so if we're looking here, this is Africa. This top part here is all in the northern hemisphere. And then also in the northern hemisphere is I spelled the wrong direction again, most of Asia, which is here, which would be like Russia, China, India. The only part that's not in the northern hemisphere is these Asian islands like Indonesia. Indonesia is not in the northern hemisphere. It's in the southern hemisphere. Speaking of the southern hemisphere, most of South America, there we go, is in the southern hemisphere. So here, if you look at the rest of South America, when you study the Inca are in South America, or were located in South America, and they're in the southern hemisphere, along with part of Africa. So this bottom part of Africa is in southern hemisphere. Also, Australia is completely in the southern hemisphere. So that's where your kangaroos and all that are, in the southern hemisphere. And also, boop, Antarctica is that down in the southern hemisphere. If I move too fast, remember you can always pause the video, catch up, and then start it back up again. If we divide the world up and down instead of side to side, we get a western and an eastern hemisphere. We're going to start in the western hemisphere, which is this hemisphere here. And it includes, again, North America. So you are also in the western hemisphere. When you study 5th grade social studies, you study everything in the western hemisphere. That's why you study the Inca, the Aztec, the Mayan, Native Americans, the Mississippian. They're all in the western hemisphere. In addition, half of Antarctica is in the western hemisphere. If you cut it down the center here, you're going to get half of it is in the western, half of it's going to be in the eastern. A small part of Europe is in the western hemisphere, and this globe is too small for me to tell. But if I remember correctly, it's like part of Ireland is in the western hemisphere. Most of Spain, Portugal, they're all in the western hemisphere, as well as a small part of Africa. So it's just kind of like this huggy piece here on the side is part of the western hemisphere. It cuts kind of right along this line. If I flip then to the other side, I went too far. The other side, okay, I have most of Europe. So it's going to be the rest of those countries. It's going to be France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Poland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Ukraine. Those are all over here in the eastern hemisphere. Half of Antarctica, so the other half of Antarctica is in the eastern hemisphere. And Asia is in the eastern hemisphere. That's why we're going to study Asian countries here in 6th grade social studies. We're going to look at China. We're going to look at Egypt. We're going to look at Mesopotamia. We're going to look at India. So we're going to look at some of those countries that are in the eastern hemisphere. So again, if you kind of look at it here on your computer screen, we have the northern hemisphere is up here. This whole thing's part of the northern hemisphere. This whole thing is the southern hemisphere. And then if you divide it here down this center line up and down, we have the western hemisphere and the eastern hemisphere. So a continent like North America is in the northern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. They're in both. So pausing real quick, we need to talk about what the difference is between a map and a globe. Okay, so this is a globe. Obviously, you guys know what globes are. If I were to pull out a map, oof, sitting on my chair. Here's my map, right? Maps are flat. Flat, okay? Globes are round. You obviously know that, right? Globes, actually, even though they seem like they wouldn't be, globes are actually more accurate than maps are. And that's just because the world is actually round. So when you think about the size of countries, the countries on this map or on this globe is going to be more accurate than something that's flat. Please don't be a flat earther. The earth is not flat. It is round. So globes are actually more accurate on a big scale. Now, obviously, if you're trying to figure out how to get to Walmart, you're going to use a flat map. You're not going to try and use the globe to figure out how you're going to get to Walmart. I can't even find Van Wert on this little globe. It's like way tiny, guys, like way tiny. So obviously when you're trying to get someplace from like one place to another on a small scale, you're gonna use a flat map. But when you're looking at like the sizes of countries, where they are in location to each other, a globe is really gonna be your better bet. And that's because flat maps distort the shape of the countries. Now let's define the word distort here. The word distort actually means to twist out of shape. So what it does is when you flatten out a circle, if you've ever tried to flatten out a sphere like this, it doesn't flatten very well. The countries kind of look funky. You have to cut it up in some weird places. So it doesn't work quite as well. Flat globes or spheres just don't flatten into flat rectangles like this. So when they make this, it makes it very distorted. Here up in the corner, this is, here we go. This is Greenland. Greenland looks huge on this map. It looks like so much bigger than the United States, but it's really not. In all honesty, the United States is probably about the same size, if not bigger, than Greenland. But it looks huge on that map because flat maps distort it. It can make countries look bigger or smaller than they actually are. Now, normally we would click on this link here, and maybe I'll show it to you sometime in a Zoom session, but for sake of time here in the video, I'm going to skip over it. Maybe I'll show it to you later on in one of our Zoom sessions. But the flat maps will make the countries look bigger or smaller than they actually are, whereas globes, you can kind of tell a little bit better how big they are in relation to each other, as long as you have one. Now, this little one's not very helpful to me. Two types of main map projection. So when I'm taking this globe and if I want to make it into a flat map, there's kind of two main ways to do it. You can do it either through the Mercator projection, which is the one that I've been showing you here on the side, or the Robinson projection. And I'm going to show you the difference between those two here in a minute. But really, it's just kind of the way that the map is presented to you. One of them has very straight lines, and the other one has more of curved lines on the map. So it really depends on how the map is like flattened out for you to see. Let me give you some examples. This is the Mercator projection, which is what I've kind of been showing you in my giant map back here. If you look at this, the lines on the Mercator projection are very straight. Okay, these lines are very straight. They're almost like grid-like. But if you look at it, these ones that are here close to the center line, which is the equator, I hope you maybe know that, these boxes look more square-like, but as you move up, they become more distorted, and that's because you're trying to flatten out a sphere. The Robinson projection, though, looks much different. Here we have curved lines, which makes the rectangles a little bit closer. They're still not super great, because anytime you flatten out a sphere, it's going to look funny. But in this case, they're a little bit closer. The countries, if you look at Greenland here, Greenland doesn't look nearly as big here as it does here. Like there's a big difference between the two countries in that case. Last thing we're going to talk about here is latitude and longitude, and this is super, super important. So if you've not gotten anything else from this, please make sure you pick up on this. The lines on the map have actual names. So these lines that go side to side and up and down, they have names, and very important names. We're going to do lots of practice with latitude and longitude. Latitude lines are the imaginary lines that run from left to right. If you think of like lat rhymes with fat, and if you think of someone being fat, they're fat like around, right? They're not fat up and down, they're fat around. So in this case, latitude and longitude lines are latitude lines, sorry. Latitude lines are lines that run from left to right. And it runs parallel to the equator. So the equator is that center line, okay, and they run parallel. So parallel, we know, are lines that go like this that never touch. So these imaginary lines run parallel to each other. The equator then is the line of latitude that separates the globe into northern and southern hemispheres, which is this one here, this shiny line on my globe. It's probably the most important line on the globe. Lots of things tie back to the equator, so definitely make sure you know what the equator is. So here, looking at a map again, I have this dotted line here is the equator, and then we go up into northern lines and southern lines. So as you climb up north, these are like 20 degrees north, 30 degrees north, 40 degrees north, and then it goes 20 degrees south, 40 degrees south, 60 degrees south. It climbs southern and northern lines. And it separates the world into two hemispheres. Longitude lines then are the opposite. Longitude lines are imaginary lines that run up and down. So in this case, it's going to be the ones that come up and down like this. Longitude lines are going to have west and east directions on them because it separates the globe into those two sections. It runs parallel to the prime meridian. The prime meridian is the name of the fancy longitude line that we all should know, right? It runs up and down at 0 degrees. It's the one that I was talking about that kind of cuts into Africa a little bit. So that's the prime meridian, which is this next line here. The prime meridian is the line of longitude that separates the globe into western and eastern hemispheres. It's the important line that helps us determine when we teach what here in social studies. But it runs parallel to all the other longitude lines. Too many L words, guys. Longitude runs up and down, and the prime meridian is the most important. And here's another picture of that. So the prime meridian really isn't shown on this one, but if we were to cut it, I'm going to guess that like probably it's cutting it into one hemisphere. This looks like the western hemisphere. So if you were to cut here though, like you go, if you counted this as 0, you'd go 20 degrees west, 30 degrees west, 40 degrees west, 20 degrees east, 30 degrees east, 40 degrees east, and it works that way. So anything to the left is west, and anything to the right is east. And it separates into western and eastern hemispheres.